Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I am going to revisit Existence and Being by Martin Heidegger and Werner Brock. Although for this episode, I have decided not to read any of the content from Werner Brock, only the section from Heidegger. The content from Werner Brock is okay. It's not bad. His analysis of this stuff is not bad, but I just didn't feel that it really added anything. So I didn't think it was a necessary addition. This book, as I said in the previous, not the most recent episode, but the last time I reviewed this particular book, part one of this series, when I looked at what is metaphysics, I pointed out this was the English-speaking world's first experience with Heidegger. This was the first English translation of anything of Heidegger's works. Werner Brock has an extended commentary on Being and Time, and then a commentary on the 4 essays that are included here by Martin Heidegger. Last time I looked at this book, like I said, I looked at what is metaphysics. Today I want to look at an essay about the German poet Holderlin. The name of this essay is Holderlin and the Essence of Poetry, and he's talking about what poetry is. Well, it's kind of interesting here because he's talking about Holderlin's poetry, and Holderlin is sort of talking about what poetry is and what the role of the poet is. So Heidegger is talking about Holderlin, talking about the poet. Then, of course, Werner Brock is talking about Heidegger, talking about Holderlin, talking about the poet. And then, of course, I'm here on my show talking about Heidegger and Brock talking about Heidegger, talking about Holderlin, talking about the poet. There's a few layers deep here, but in all seriousness, it's an interesting interpretation of poetry. There's a sort of quasi-religious component to both this essay as well as the other essay about Holderlin's poetry. I'm not going to read anything or concern myself with Heidegger's other essay about Holderlin, just this one. And he's really talking about what the role of the poet is in a society. And Holderlin as a poet, Holderlin doesn't explicitly just write essays about poetry. He writes poetry himself, but he includes commentary in a sort of somewhat veiled or subdued manner, commentary about what poetry is. So without much further ado here, let me jump right in and start reading a bit of Heidegger's essay, Holderlin and the Essence of Poetry. Heidegger says, quote, "To write about the poet, is this not a symptom of a perverted narcissism, and at the same time a confession of inadequate richness of vision? To write about the poet, is that not a senseless exaggeration, something decadent and a blind alley?" The answer will be given in what follows. To be sure, the path by which we reach the answer is one of expediency. We cannot here, as would have to be done, expound separately each of Holderlin's poems, one after the other. Instead, let us take only 5 pointers, which the poet gave us on the subject of poetry. The necessary order of these sayings and their interconnectedness ought to bring before our eyes the essential essence of poetry. In a letter to his mother, in January 1799, Holderlin calls the writing of poetry that most innocent of all occupations. To what extent is it the most innocent? Writing poetry appears in the modest guise of play. Unfettered, it invents its world of images and remains immersed in the realm of the imagined. This play thus avoids the seriousness of decisions, which always, in one way or another, creates guilt. Hence, writing poetry is completely harmless, and at the same time it is ineffectual, since it remains mere saying and speaking. It has nothing about it of action, which grasps hold directly of the real and alters it. Poetry is like a dream and not reality, a playing with words and not the seriousness of action. Poetry is harmless and ineffectual, for what can be less dangerous than mere speech? But in taking poetry to be the most innocent of all occupations, we have not yet comprehended its essence. At any rate, this gives us an indication of where we must look for it. Poetry creates its works in the realm and out of the material of language. What does Holderlin say about language? let us hear a second saying of the poet. In a fragmentary sketch, dating from the same period, 1800, as the letter just quoted, the poet says, "But man dwells in huts and wraps himself in the bashful garment, since he is more fervent and more attention to and watching over the spirit, as the priestess the divine flame, this is his understanding. And therefore he has been given arbitrariness, and to him, godlike, has been given higher power, to command and to accomplish, and therefore has language, most dangerous of possessions, been given to man, so that creating, destroying, and perishing, and returning to the ever-living, to the mistress and mother, he may affirm what he is, that he has inherited, learned from thee thy most divine possession, all-preserving love." Language, the field of the most innocent of all occupations, is the most dangerous of possessions. How can these two be reconciled? Let us put this question aside for the moment and consider the three preliminary questions. 1. Whose possession is language? 2. To what extent is it the most dangerous of possessions? 3. In what sense is it really a possession? First of all, we notice where this saying about language occurs, in the sketch for a poem, which is to describe who man is in contrast to the other beings of nature. Mention is made of the rose, the swans, the stag, and the forest. So, distinguishing plants from animals, the fragment begins, "But man dwells in huts." And who then is man? He who must affirm what he is. To affirm means to declare. But at the same time it means to give in the declaration a guarantee of what is declared. Man is he who he is, precisely in the affirmation of his own existence. This affirmation does not mean here an additional and supplementary expression of human existence, but it does in the process make plain the existence of man. But what must man affirm? That he belongs to the earth. This relation of belonging to consists in the fact that man is heir and learner in all things. But all these things are in conflict. That which keeps things apart in opposition, and thus at the same time binds them together, is called by Holderlin intimacy. The affirmation of belonging to this intimacy occurs through the creation of a world and its ascent, and likewise through the destruction of a world and its decline. The affirmation of human existence, and hence its essential consummation, occurs through freedom of decision. This freedom lays hold of the necessary, and places itself in the bonds of a supreme obligation. This bearing witness of belonging to all that is existent becomes actual as history. In order that history may be possible, language has been given to man. It is one of man's possessions. But to what extent is language the most dangerous of possessions? It is the danger of all dangers, because it creates initially the possibility of a danger. Danger is the threat to existence from what is existent. But now it is only by virtue of language at all that man is exposed to something manifest, which, as what is existent, afflicts and inflames man in his existence, and as what is non-existent deceives and disappoints. It is language which first creates the manifest conditions for menace and confusion to existence, and thus the possibility of the loss of existence, that is to say, danger. But language is not only the danger of dangers, but necessarily conceals in itself a continual danger for itself. Language has the task of making manifest in its work the existent, and of preserving it as such. In it, what is purest and what is most concealed, and likewise what is complex and ordinary, can be expressed in words. Even the essential word, if it is to be understood and so become a possession in common, must make itself ordinary. Accordingly, it is remarked in another fragment of Holderlin's, "Thou spokest to the Godhead, but this you have all forgotten, that the first fruits are never for mortals, they belong to the gods. The fruit must become more ordinary, more everyday, and then it will be mortal's own." The pure and the ordinary are both equally something said. Hence, the word as word never gives any direct guarantee as to whether it is an essential word or a counterfeit. On the contrary, an essential word often looks in its simplicity like an unessential one. and on the other hand, that which is dressed up to look like the essential is only something recited by heart or repeated. Therefore, language must constantly present itself in an appearance which it itself attests, and hence endanger what is most characteristic of it, the genuine saying. In what sense, however, is this most dangerous thing one of man's possessions? Language is his own property. It is at his disposal, for the purpose of communicating his experiences, resolutions, and moods. Language serves to give information. As a fit instrument for this, it is a possession. But the essence of language does not consist entirely in being a means of giving information. This definition does not touch its essential essence, but merely indicates an effect of its essence. Language is not a mere tool, one of the many which man possesses. On the contrary, it is only language that affords the very possibility of standing in the openness of the existent. Only where there is language is there world, i.e., the perpetually altering circuit of decision and production, of action and responsibility, but also of commotion and arbitrariness, of decay and confusion. Only where world predominates is there history. Language is a possession in a more fundamental sense. It is good for the fact that, i.e., it affords a guarantee that, man can exist historically. Language is not a tool at his disposal. Rather, it is that event which disposes of the supreme possibility of human existence. We must first of all be certain of this essence of language, in order to comprehend truly the sphere of action of poetry, and with it, poetry itself. How does language become actual? In order to find the answer to this question, let us consider a third saying of Holderlin's. We come across this saying in a long and involved sketch for the unfinished poem, which begins, "Reconciling one who never believed." Much has man learnt, many of the heavenly ones has he named, since we have been a conversation and have been able to hear from one another. Let us first pick out from these lines the part which has a direct bearing on what we have said so far. Since we have been a conversation. We, mankind, are a conversation. The being of men is founded in language, but this only becomes actual in conversation. Nevertheless, the latter is not merely a manner in which language is put into effect. Rather, it is only as conversation that language is essential. What we usually mean by language, namely a stock of words and syntactical rules, is only a threshold of language. But now, what is meant by a conversation? Plainly, the act of speaking with others about something. Then, speaking also brings about the process of coming together. But Holderlin says, since we have been a conversation and have been able to hear from one another. Being able to hear is not a mere consequence of speaking with one another. On the contrary, it is rather presupposed in the latter process. But even the ability to hear is itself also adapted to the possibility of the word, and makes use of it. The ability to speak and the ability to hear are equally fundamental. We are a conversation, and that means we can hear from one another. We are a conversation. That always means at the same time we are a single conversation. But the unity of a conversation consists in the fact that in the essential word there is always manifest that one and the same thing on which we agree, and on the basis of which we are united, and so are essentially ourselves. Conversation and its unity support our existence. End quote. Okay, so that was certainly a slightly longer section where he introduces 5 pointers. He only discusses the first 3 of them, but he says basically we're going to go through and we're going to look at 5 concepts. He calls them pointers, but they're like concepts, 5 statements of Holderlin's that we can use to help us understand what poetry is. And he gives the first 3 in that section. The first one is that poetry is the most innocent of all occupations. The second is that language is the most dangerous of man's possessions. And the third is that we have been a conversation, or we are a conversation. So I think it's interesting, if there's his first statement about the innocence of poetry, the innocence of the occupation of the poet, is explained, I think, pretty clearly. where you could say poetry isn't really, it's disconnected from action. It's not telling you how to do something. It's not telling you to do something. It's not describing history. It lives in the realm of the imagination. And there may be some component of history, but poetry is not history, right? It's its own separate thing, and it doesn't really connect with anything else extremely concretely. It might draw some component of history into the poem, but poetry itself it's like play. It serves no real practical purpose. It's a sort of game of words. It's a play, and in that sense, it's innocent. It has no real what we might first see as a real sort of responsibility to do something. But then he says that language is man's most dangerous of possessions. And I don't think this one is explained quite as well, or maybe it's just harder to understand. But language, having language and using language is fundamental to humans as being cognizant, intelligent creatures. It's fundamental to us insofar as we are social with one another. We use language in every aspect of our relationships with one another. We have history because we have language, and we understand ourselves as a thing that endures through time and has a history, right? I mean, animals don't have history. Dogs don't have history. Giraffes, they don't tell stories about what happened in previous generations. They don't know anything about, before their own memory. They're never shared information about the past. And so they don't have the sort of being that we have. We're fundamentally different from animals, and the primary method of our difference is that we're able to convey ideas with one another. We're able to record history. We're able to define concepts. We're able to learn from one another about these concepts. And so, in a sense, language is who we are, and it's so crucial to who we are. And I think one thing that he's getting at here is that language has the capacity to destroy, as well as it has the capacity to create. So that's certainly like the primordialness of language. But how is language really dangerous? That's the part that I don't think is extremely clear. Language has the capacity to confuse us. Language has the capacity to lead us astray. It has the capacity to hide and to reveal. And you could certainly use language to convince people to destroy one another. You could convince people to adopt ridiculous and insane ideas. If we go back to the original quote where he pulled that from, Holderlin says, he has been given, meaning mankind, he has been given arbitrariness, and to him, godlike, has been given higher power to command and to accomplish, and therefore has language, most dangerous of possessions, been given to man, so that creating, destroying, and perishing, and returning to the ever-living, to the mistress and mother, he may affirm what he is. So it's got a tremendous destructive and creative power, and I think we can probably leave it at that. And then the third was where he said, the third pointer, or the third concept introduced, is where he says that man is a conversation. So, right, I mean, language is not something that you possess or use on your own or in a vacuum. You talk with other people. You have language so you can talk to other people. Other people have taught you how to talk. And so it's fundamentally communal. Nobody just invents language in their head prior to receiving language from others and learning what language is. Most people don't invent languages anyhow, but the point is it's a deeply interpersonal phenomena. It exists so that we can speak with one another and share information. And he says it's not entirely just sharing information. Sharing information is a function of language, but it's not the real core of language. I think it really is pretty fundamental. I think the origin of language really is in communicating with one another about concepts. And he says we're a conversation, Where a single conversation, the unity of a conversation consists in the fact that in the essential word there is always manifest that one and the same thing on which we agree. So there's a unity in conversation in that we both agree on certain things. Basic facts of reality. First of all, of course, the meaning of words. We have to agree on the meaning of words or we really can't speak with one another. And there's a sort of unity when we share these meanings and these concepts, because a lot of what we are, how we think about things, what our opinions are, what our culture looks like, comes down to what words we have. I mean, you've all heard how the Eskimos have like 27 words for snow. Some people people who think hierarchically will have hierarchical words. People who think more in a more egalitarian manner will have lots of words for different factors and features of egalitarianism. Whatever concept looms large in your mind is going to get developed in language. And so what language you adopt is going to carry with it a whole bunch of premises about what's important and what's not important. Is snow the sort of thing that is a critical part of our lives that we have to be able to differentiate? Or is snow just snow? Is snow, who cares? Different cultures are going to convey values through their languages. They're going to convey concepts about the world through what words they have and what words they don't have. What concepts go unspoken and probably unconceived. So there's a unity in among people that's founded in language and founded in conversation. So let's move forward a little bit. There's really 5 concepts. He introduced the first 3 there. For this next section, I want to introduce the 4th of his important concepts. And he says, quote, "Since when have we been a conversation? Where there is to be a single conversation, the essential word must be constantly related to the one and the same. Without this relation, an argument too is absolutely impossible. But the one and the same can only be manifest in the light of something perpetual and permanent. Yet permanence and perpetuity only appear when what persists and is present begins to shine. But that happens in the moment when time opens out and extends. After man has placed himself in the presence of something perpetual, then only can he expose himself to the changeable, to that which comes and goes, for only the persistent is changeable. Only after ravenous time has been riven into present, past, and future does the possibility arise of agreeing on something permanent. We have been a single conversation since the time when it is time. But ever since time arose, we have existed historically. Both existence as a single conversation and historical existence are alike ancient. They belong together and are the same thing. Since we have been a conversation, man has learnt much and named many of the heavenly ones. Since language really became actual as conversation, the gods have acquired names, and a world has appeared. But again, it should be noticed, the presence of the gods and the appearance of the world are not merely a consequence of the actualization of language, they are contemporaneous with it. And this to the extent that it is precisely in the naming of the gods and in the transmutation of the world into word that the real conversation, which we ourselves are, consists. But the gods can acquire a name only by addressing and, as it were, claiming us. The word which names the gods is always a response to such a claim. This response always springs from the responsibility of a destiny. It is in the process by which the gods bring our existence to language that we enter the sphere of the decision as to whether we are to yield ourselves to the gods or withhold ourselves from them. Only now can we appreciate in its entirety what is meant by "since we have been a conversation." Since the gods have led us into conversation, since time has been time, ever since then the basis of our existence has been a conversation. The proposition that language is the supreme event of human existence has, through it, acquired its meaning and foundation. But the question at once arises, how does this conversation, which we are, begin? Who accomplishes this naming of the gods? Who lays hold of something permanent in ravenous time and fixes it in the word? Holderlin tells us, with the sure simplicity of the poet. Let us hear a fourth saying. This saying forms the conclusion of the poem Remembrance and runs, but that which remains is established by the poets. This saying throws light on our question about the essence of poetry. Poetry is the act of establishing by the word and in the word. What is established in this manner? The permanent. But can the permanent be established then? Is it not that which has always been present? No. Even the permanent must be fixed, so that it will not be carried away. The simple must be wrested from confusion. Proportion must be set before what lacks proportion. That which supports and dominates the existent in its entirety must become manifest. Being must be opened out, so that the existent may appear. But this very permanent is the transitory. Thus, swiftly passing is everything heavenly, but not in vain. But that this should remain is entrusted to the poets as a care and a service. The poets name the gods and names all things in that which they are. This naming does not consist merely in something already known being supplied with a name. It is rather that when the poet speaks the essential word, the existent is by this naming nominated as what it is, so it becomes known as existent. Poetry is the establishing of being by means of the word. Hence, that which remains is never taken from the transitory. The simple can never be picked out immediately from the intricate. Proportion does not lie in what lacks proportion. We never find the foundation in what is bottomless. Being is never inexistent. But, because being and essence of things can never be calculated and derived from what is present, they must be freely created, laid down, and given. Such a free act of giving is establishment. But when the gods are named originally, and the essence of things receives a name, so that things for the first time shine out, human existence is brought into a firm relation and given a basis. The speech of the poet is establishment, not only in the sense of the free act of giving, but at the same time in the sense of the firm basing of human existence on its foundation. End quote. Okay, so that one is obviously a little tricky. He talks about, he says, since we've been a conversation, man has learnt much and named many of the heavenly ones. Since language really becomes actual as conversation, the gods have acquired names, and a world has appeared. So he brings in the concept of the naming of the gods. He says the presence of the gods and the appearance of the world are not merely a consequence of the actualization of language, they are contemporaneous with it. And this to the extent that it is precisely the naming of the gods and in the transmutation of the world into word that the real conversation which we ourselves are consists. So in a sense, the appearance of language, the introduction of conversation, happens simultaneous with and in a way as a consequence of the naming of the gods, right? The birth of language and the naming of the gods are sort of the same thing. But the gods can acquire names only by addressing and claiming us. The word which names the gods is always a response to such a claim. So in a sense, there is this idea, he kind of, I think he almost contradicts himself. He says it's not that these things are, and we know about them, and then we simply append a word to them. But he also says that the gods aren't just invented, but that the gods initiate the naming. He says gods can acquire a name only by addressing and, as it were, claiming us. The word which names the gods is always a response to such a claim. So first comes the claim, the gods claim us. As a response, they acquire names. He says the gods have led us into conversation. And he also says, since the gods have led us into conversation, since time has been time, ever since then the basis of our existence has been a conversation. So that's the starting point of language, the starting point of conversation, is us being led into conversation by the gods. And that's also when time became time, because in a sense that's when we began to have something alike history. We began to see ourselves placed within time, placed within a permanent framework. He jumps into the fourth concept here, which is related to a quote from Holderlin, that which remains is established by the poets. Brief little quote, but the concept that what remains or what is permanent is established by the poets. He says, the poet names the gods and names all things in that which they are, but this naming does not consist merely in something already known being supplied with a name. It is rather that when the poet speaks the essential word, the existent is by this naming nominated as what it is. So it's kind of pulling things out of experience, out of the world, and proclaiming it to exist, proclaiming a thing to be a thing. He says poetry is the establishing of being by means of the word. He says, when the gods are named originally and the essence of things receives a name so that things for the first time shine out, human existence is brought into a firm relation and given a basis. The speech of the poet is establishment, not only in the sense of the free act of giving, but at the same time in the sense of the firm basing of human existence on its foundation. It's just various different ways of saying that this is all the naming of the gods, the establishment of language, the establishment of the conversation, the establishment of being, the establishment of history, the establishment of our presence within time, the establishment of our knowledge of permanency. All of these things happen sort of simultaneously, and they're all in the hands of the poet. So in this sense, the role of the poet certainly goes from whimsy to the most important role in human history. So let's move on to the fifth point, where he says, quote, if we conceive this essence of poetry as the establishing of being by means of the word, then we can have some inkling of the truth, of that saying which Holderlin spoke long after he had been received into the protection of the night of lunacy. We find this fifth pointer in the long and at the same time monstrous poem, which begins, in the lovely azure there flowers with its metallic roof the church tower. Here, Holderlin says, full of merit, and yet poetically, dwells man on this earth. What man works at and pursues is through his own endeavors earned and deserved. Yet, says Holderlin in sharp antithesis, all this does not touch the essence of his sojourn on this earth. All that does not reach the foundation of human existence. The latter is fundamentally poetic. But now we understand poetry as the inaugural naming of the gods and of the essence of things. To dwell poetically means to stand in the presence of the gods, and to be involved in the proximity of the essence of things. Existence is poetical in its fundamental aspect, which means at the same time, insofar as it is established or founded, it is not a recompense, but a gift. Poetry is not merely an ornament, accompanying existence, not merely a temporary enthusiasm, or nothing but an interest and amusement. Poetry is the foundation which supports history, and therefore it is not a mere appearance of culture, and absolutely not the mere expression of a culture soul. That our existence is fundamentally poetic, this cannot, in the last resort, mean that it is really only a harmless game. But does not Holderlin himself, in the first pointer which we quoted, call poetry that most innocent of all occupations? How can this be reconciled with the essence of poetry as we are now revealing it? This brings us back to the question which we laid aside in the first instance. In now proceeding to answer this question, we will try at the same time to summarize and bring before the inner eye the essence of poetry and of the poet. First of all, it appeared that the field of action of poetry is language. Hence, the essence of poetry must be understood through the essence of language. Afterwards, it became clear that poetry is the inaugural naming of being and of all the essence of all things. Not just any speech, but that particular kind which, for the first time, brings into the open all that which we then discuss and deal with in everyday language. Hence, poetry never takes language as a raw material ready to hand. Rather, it is poetry which first makes language possible. poetry is the primitive language of a historical people. Therefore, in just the reverse manner, the essence of language must be understood through the essence of poetry. The foundation of human existence is conversation, in which language does truly become actual, but primitive language is poetry, in which being is established. Yet language is the most dangerous of possessions. Thus, poetry is the most dangerous of work, and at the same time, the most innocent of all occupations. In fact, it is only if we combine these two definitions and conceive them as one that we fully comprehend the essence of poetry. End quote. So this fifth pointer is a little bit harder to extract much from. His fifth pointer is essentially the part of the poem where he says, or part of a poem, where he says, full of merit and yet poetically dwells man on this earth. So what he's really extracting here is the idea that man dwells poetically in the earth. What does it mean to dwell poetically? He says, to dwell poetically means to stand in the presence of the gods and to be involved in the proximity of the essence of things. So then he points out that it's not just an ornament accompanying existence. It's not enthusiasm or amusement. Poetry is the foundation which supports history. So it's not the appearance of a culture, and it's not the expression of a culture soul. It's the founding of a culture. It's the birth of a culture. And then he sort of summarizes a bit of what he's said so far. And he says that, yeah, okay, language is the most dangerous of possessions. Poetry, rooted in language, must be the most dangerous work. At the same time, it's the most innocent of occupations. How can these things be reconciled? And then he goes on to dabble a little bit in some more of Holderlin's statements. And then he gets to the section where he says the following. Quote, in the very appearance of its outer fringe, the essence of poetry seems to waver and yet stands firm. In fact, it is itself essentially establishment, that is to say, an act of firm foundation. Yet every inaugural act remains a free gift. And Holderlin hears it said, let poets be free as swallows. But this freedom is not undisciplined arbitrariness and capricious desire, but supreme necessity. Poetry, as the act of establishing being, is subject to a twofold control. In considering these integral laws, we first grasp the essence entire. The writing of poetry is the fundamental naming of the gods. But the poetic word only acquires its power of naming when the gods themselves bring us to language. How do the gods speak? And signs to us from antiquity are the language of the gods. The speech of the poet is the intercepting of these signs, in order to pass them on to his own people. This intercepting is an act of receiving, and yet at the same time a fresh act of giving. For in the first signs the poet catches sight already of the completed message, and in his word boldly presents what he has glimpsed, so as to tell in advance of the not yet fulfilled. So, the bold spirit, like an eagle, before the tempest flies, prophesying in the path of his advancing gods. The establishment of being is bound to the signs of the gods, and at the same time the poetic word is only the interpretation of the voice of the people. This is how Holderlin names the sayings in which a people remembers that it belongs to the totality of all that exists. But often this voice grows dumb and weary. In general, even it is not capable of saying of itself what is true, but has need of those who explain it. The poem which bears the title Voice of the People has been handed down to us in two versions. It is above all the concluding stanzas which are different, but the difference is such that they supplement one another. In the first version, the ending runs, because it is pious, I honor for love of the heavenly ones, the people's voice, the tranquil, yet for the sake of gods and men, may it not always be tranquil too willingly. And the second version is, and truly, sayings are good, for they are a reminder of the highest, yet something is also needed to explain the holy sayings. In this way, the essence of poetry is joined on to the laws of the signs of the gods and of the voice of the people, laws which tend towards and away from each other. The poet himself stands between the former, the gods, and the latter, the people. He is one who has been cast out, out into that between gods and men. But only and for the first time in this between is it decided who man is and where he is settling his existence. Poetically dwells man on this earth. Unceasingly and ever more securely, out of the fullness of the images pressing about him, and always more simply, did Holderlin devote his poetic word to this realm of between. And this compels us to say that he is the poet of the poet. End quote. So here we get a couple of quotes, a couple sections from Holderlin that Heidegger talks about. The first of them is, signs to us from antiquity are the language of the gods. So, the question is, he says, the writing of poetry is the fundamental naming of the gods, but the poetic word only acquires its power of naming when the gods themselves bring us to language. So how do the gods speak? Signs to us from antiquity are the language of the gods. The speech of the poet is the intercepting of these signs in order to pass them on to his own people. I think that's an important line. The intercepting of the signs to us from antiquity. And what does that mean? What is a sign to us from antiquity? Unfortunately, he doesn't really say too much about that specific phrase, but he says the speech of the poet is the intercepting of these signs in order to pass them on to his own people. So the intercepting is an act of receiving, of course, receiving the signs from antiquity, but also a fresh act of giving. In the first signs, the poet catches sight already of the completed message, and in his word boldly presents what he has glimpsed so as to tell in advance of the not yet fulfilled. So it's a sort of prophetic factor here, right? It's the poet catches this sign from antiquity, but sees a glimpse of the completed message, and he's sharing the not yet fulfilled. He's presenting what he's glimpsed and telling in advance of the not yet fulfilled. And then that brings up the second Holderlin quote, the bold spirit like an eagle before the tempests flies, prophesying in the path of his advancing gods. So here you have like the poet catching a glimpse of the gods that will be worshipped in the future. They're not yet there. The poet is prophesying in the path of his advancing gods. But now we start to see something about the voice of the people. He says the poetic word is only the interpretation of the voice of the people. He says this is how Holderlin names the sayings in which a people remembers that it belongs to the totality of all that exists. Sayings, I guess, cliches, mantras, sayings, in which a people remembers that it belongs to the totality of all that exists. This part I find a little more challenging. I don't know why we would assume that the sayings constitute the voice of the people or really are the method by which a people remembers that it belongs to the totality of all that exists. I don't know how you get that from sayings exactly. He says, at any rate, he says, he's got a poem called Voice of the People, and there are two versions, and this is where we get the last two quotes from Holderlin, and there are two different versions of the ending. And in one version of the ending, he says, I honor for love of the heavenly ones the people's voice, the tranquil, yet for the sake of gods and men may it not always be tranquil too willingly. So he honors the people's voice, but when he changes it to the second version, he says, truly sayings are good, for they are a reminder of the highest, yet something is also needed to explain the holy sayings. So we have two things happening, the sign of the gods and the voice of the people. Two factors here, which tend toward and away from each other. The poet stands between the former, the gods, and the latter, the people. He is one who has been cast out to that between gods and men. And he says that Holderlin devoted his poetic word to the realm of between gods and men. And that is the realm of the poet. So this is interesting here. The poet is receiving the sign of the gods, receiving the message of the gods in a non-linguistic form, but an experience of the gods, and then puts it into words and shares that to his people. It seems to me that's kind of what's happening. He brings it back in the form of poetry and presents it to his people. So moving on, he says, quote, Holderlin writes poetry about the essence of poetry, but not in the sense of a timelessly valid concept. This essence of poetry belongs to a determined time, but not in such a way that it merely conforms to this time as to one which is already in existence. It is that Holderlin, in the act of establishing the essence of poetry, first determines a new time. It is the time of the gods that have fled and of the God that is coming. It is the time of need, because it lies under a double lack and a double not, the no more of the gods that have fled and the not yet of the God that is coming. The essence of poetry, which Holderlin establishes, is in the highest degree historical, because it anticipates a historical time, but as a historical essence, it is the sole essential essence. The time is needy, and therefore its poet is extremely rich, so rich that he would often like to relax in thoughts of those that have been and in eager waiting for that which is coming, and would like only to sleep in this apparent emptiness. But he holds his ground in the nothing of this night. Whilst the poet remains thus by himself in the supreme isolation of his mission, he fashions truly, vicariously, and therefore truly, for his people. End quote. So now we have this idea that Holderlin is not just describing an era or a time. He is declaring a new era. He says, Holderlin, in the act of establishing the essence of poetry, first determines a new time. And here we get this idea that we live in a time of need. We live in the time of the no more of the gods that have fled and the not yet of the God that is coming. So the gods of our world are here no longer, right? They have fled the world. What we knew as the gods have fled, and the new God has not yet arrived. And I always find it kind of odd and interesting that when he's speaking of the past, he speaks of the gods, but when he speaks of the God that is coming, it's always a singular, a God, but it's never capitalized like God himself, God that we know of when we think of, God with a capital G is coming, but like the Abrahamic God, but a lowercase g like a God is coming, not the God is coming, but a God is coming. The gods have fled, and we stand in an era in between. I would argue that what's coming is probably more like the gods. It's probably, I think we have on the horizon some sort of a return to a type of polytheism. But it's interesting because the poet is sort of declared as he who is standing between the gods and his people. And sometimes he says the people, and sometimes he says his people. The ending of that section says, whilst the poet remains thus by himself in the supreme isolation of his mission, he fashions truth for his people. So he does say at times he says his people, but at any rate he's fashioning things for his people. The poet is receiving the gods, the message of the gods, the message of the coming gods, right? The poet is prophetic in this way, as we just saw. He receives the message of the advancing gods, flies ahead of the advancing gods, and is their herald. And then the gods come after. So the old gods are gone, the new gods haven't arrived, and the poet would like to sort of sleep during this time of quietude, but he doesn't. The true poet is awake and crafting messages for his people, taking what he can so he stands between the gods and the people. It's not that the gods don't exist, they're just not right here, right now. They're not speaking with us right now. They're perhaps speaking to the poet of the time when they shall arrive. So there are two ways here. And one, the poet is in advance, is flying like an eagle in advance of the gods, heralding their oncoming arrival, and also in a time of quiet between the gods that have left and have not yet arrived. So the poet sort of serves a purpose for his people. And I want to compare this to the past few episodes where I've spoken of the individualism of Jungian psychology. The Jungian psychology sees the psychoanalyst as standing between the conscious and the unconscious. And in helping the person, the individual who has gone to speak to the psychoanalyst, helping that person reach their unconscious archetypes. But it's psychoanalysis exists for the person. You don't really hear about the psychoanalysis for the people. The psychoanalysis is for the individual to help them come to terms with themselves. And all of the parts of the subconscious mind exist for that person. But we see in poetry something different. The poet, as opposed to the psychoanalyst, the poet stands between the people and the gods. So the poet is getting something from the collective unconscious, perhaps, and bringing it to collective consciousness. He is bringing things into the light from the darkness, making things manifest for his people. He's going into you could almost say he's going into the underworld of unconsciousness. He's going into the realm of dreams and acquiring things, messages and information, names and words and concepts, and bringing them back out into the light and sharing them with his people to establish a culture. And the difference between these two, I think, is an important thing to point out, but also the potential similarity. If we were to take psychoanalysis and expand it to say we actually can we can actually draw things from the unconscious and present them to the people. If we were to find a sort of hybrid between the poet and the psychoanalysis that would be able to put names to things in the dark recesses of the unconscious mind and turn them into cultural norms, cultural concepts, religious concepts, gods. What would that look like to be one half psychoanalyst and one half poet? So that you're speaking to the person, but you're also, and perhaps even more so, speaking to the people. A psychoanalysis that was less interested in the individual. I don't know, an interesting concept and an interesting exercise to sort of compare the two. But at any rate, I'm going to wrap it up here. Thanks a lot for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.